Hi, I am Brittany Lodato, VP of Operations at JDJ Consulting, and today we are going to discuss navigating the pathway to compliance for USP 800. To get started, I'd like to explain what a hazardous drug is, because these drugs, they pose a very specific exposure risk to healthcare workers due to the carcinogenicity or the genotoxicity. There are three groups of hazardous drugs that have been designated by NIOSH. And it's important to know the difference between these groups because as we move through USP 800, we're going to notice that there are different requirements for handling different groups of hazardous drugs. Group 1 are antineoplastic, Group 2 are non-antineoplastic, and Group 3 are those drugs that pose a reproductive risk. The United States Pharmacopoeia is an organization that creates standards for how we use and handle drugs in the United States. Now, these standards have been drawn upon by federal agencies, state agencies, and accrediting agencies to create regulations that we must abide by at healthcare facilities. You're probably familiar with USP 797, which is where we get a lot of our information about how we prepare medications and our 1 hour rule and our beyond use dating of our medications. So now USP 800 specifically speaks to hazardous drugs, and that is what we're going to discuss today. So let's talk about some of the myths surrounding USP 800 and clarify them as we move forward. The first myth is that only hospitals need to comply with USP 800. And in fact, it's any healthcare facility that handles or stocks hazardous drugs. And that's even if you only use them on occasion. Even if you only have one hazardous drug on a crash cart, you still have to comply with USP 800. Another thing that I have heard is that if you have a RCRA black bin, you're all set, that you're completely compliant. I wish that were true, but unfortunately, that's not the case. Hazardous waste and hazardous drugs are two different things. So when we talk about that RCRA black bin, we're really talking about waste. So 800, what we're talking about today, those are the hazardous drugs. And we are going to talk about the differences a little bit later. The next myth is if you only have one hazardous drug, USP 800 is optional. Again, I wish that were the case, but the truth is, even if you just have one hazardous drug, you still need to become compliant. If you stock hazardous drugs, you need to be compliant with everything in USP 800. Thankfully, that one is also not true. For facilities that are purchasing final dosage forms, they can perform a risk assessment that allows a lot of exceptions to the chapter. And this is another area where it's very important to understand the differences between that NIOSH Group 1, Group 2, and Group 3, because through using those final dosage forms and completing your risk assessment, you're going to determine exactly which parts of 800 pertain to you. I think finally, the biggest thing we need to remember here, the biggest myth, is a requirement versus recommendation. Just because it is written in USP 800 does not mean that it is a requirement. So as you move through that chapter, if you have not already read it, I highly recommend that you do. Go through and pay special attention to where you see words like recommendation. Because if it's a recommendation, you are not required to comply with that area. It will say things like you must or you are required to. Those are the areas that you know, okay, we're going to have to do this if it pertains to us. But if it is a recommendation, it is optional. One of the questions I've gotten a lot is, we have been handling hazardous drugs for so long, for so many years. Why are we doing this now? And I think it's important to take a step back and remember that we're constantly becoming better. We're constantly changing how we do things in healthcare to make it safer for our patients and safer for ourselves. There's a lot of things that we do today that we did not used to do. Several hundred years ago, surgeries were performed without the surgeons washing their hands. And I think that we're a little bit better off today having hand hygiene. So that's just a small example of how things have changed over the years. So I just caution you, stay away from this dangerous phrase that we've always done it this way. We learn things as we progress through healthcare, and we just get better. That's what we do. So I think that USP 800 and our new standards for handling hazardous drugs, they're very important to minimize exposure to our healthcare workers, and they're going to put us in a better place in the end. So let's talk about USP 800. It governs the safe handling of those hazardous drugs for all healthcare settings. Our deadline for compliance is December 1st, and you may be wondering, well, is USP or the FDA or some other agency going to come and survey me and see if I'm complying with them? Well, they're not going to come, but you need to remember that since federal, state, and accrediting agencies draw from the United States Pharmacopeia standards, it is likely that your state surveyors and your accrediting surveyors and CMS survey are going to have, regulations based on USP 800. So while we're not concerned about USP coming to survey, we do know that these standards will be put into the regs that you're already beholden to. There are 18 sections of Chapter 800, and we are going to go through each one of those areas in very broad, brief summary, because USP 800 is a pretty dense standard. So like I said before, please, I invite you to go read that and highlight it and make notes. But for today's presentation, we just want to introduce you to USP 800 and give you an idea of what you might be encountering. While I have an opportunity now, I just want to insert a little disclaimer that by no means is this presentation meant to be an all-inclusive education session on everything about 800, and it's certainly not meant to be a one-stop shop to make you fully compliant with everything in the chapter. But we do want you to feel introduced to it and have a general idea about what 800 entails. So if you're watching this, you're probably starting to think, oh wow, am I going to be affected by USP 800? So we're going to talk about how you determine whether or not you will need to comply. First thing you're going to do is you're going to grab your formulary, and if you're unfamiliar with what a formulary is, that's just another way to say it is a list of all of the drugs that you have at your facility. And that includes everything in your emergency carts, everything in your refrigerator, everything top to bottom. So you need that complete list in front of you. And you're going to cross-reference that list with the NIOSH list of hazardous drugs for healthcare, the 2016 edition. And you could also download the HazRx app from USP. I really like this app. It costs a few dollars. I think it might be $3 or $4 in the App Store, but it's definitely worth it. You type in the name of the drug, and it tells you whether or not it's hazardous, and it also gives you a lot of useful information about that drug. So you're going to go through that formulary, and you're going to see if your drugs appear on that NIOSH list or if they pop up in the HazRx app. Now, when you do that, I think it would be a great idea to make note of whether or not they're Group 1, Group 2, or Group 3. That will be useful information for you later. It's also worth noting that if you happen to be a JDJ client and you're watching this, please make sure you've sent us your formulary. We are going through our clients' formularies for them as a complimentary service and tagging all of the hazardous drugs. So we're making it really easy for them to determine whether or not they're affected. But if you're not one of our clients or you have not sent us your formulary, please go ahead and check your formulary and see if any of the NIOSH drugs appear there. The other thing I do want to mention is that we are working off the 2016 edition of that list. NIOSH did put out a proposed update for 2018, but that has been in revision and comment for quite a long time. So as of now, it is October of 2019. As of now, it is still not published. So we are going off of the 2016 version. So next up, if you determine that you do have hazardous drugs on your formulary, take a look and see whether or not you want to keep them. I've had conversations with several healthcare facilities that didn't even realize they had hazardous drugs on formulary. And when I brought it to their attention, they said, oh, we haven't used this in quite a long time. I don't think we need it on formulary. And they discussed that with their medical director and director of anesthesiology and ultimately decided to remove it from the list. So since it's not on formulary, since it's not in their facility, they do not have to worry about complying with USP 800. So see if that is an option for you. But if you do determine that you have hazardous drugs and you do use them often, then we're going to go ahead and talk more about how you can become compliant. And here we see a list of some of the common hazardous drugs, but by no means is that all-inclusive, and you should definitely still take a look at the NIOSH list or that HazRx app to see if your drugs appear there. USP 800 can be simplified down to two compliance pathways. There's either the full compliance or the risk assessment. Full compliance means you would need to do everything that is in the requirement sections of that chapter, not necessarily the recommendations. Organizations that are most likely to have to comply with the full chapter include outsourcing facilities, manufacturers, and hospitals. And that's because those facilities are most likely to be compounding or mixing those hazardous drugs. We know that those pose the greatest risk for exposure, so they need to, of course, have the greatest measures to minimize the exposure. The risk assessment pathway is more likely to be for outpatient facilities, including ambulatory surgery centers. That's because those facilities can certainly choose to only purchase final dosage forms of those drugs. And really, all they're going to be doing is storing or repackaging or administering those drugs. So the exposure risk is a lot lower than the facilities who are handling the raw hazardous drug materials. Now, if you were to have to fully comply, it's most likely you would need a hood, like a laminar flow hood, and that would be located in a clean room. If you don't already have those in place or installed at your facility, it's likely to be very costly. And then we also know there's a huge human resource aspect to this. Do you have the staff available to be compliant? Are you going to have to hire a pharmacist or have a pharmacist on staff? So there are a lot of things to consider if you plan to become fully compliant with the entire 800 chapter, especially if you're an outpatient facility. If you're currently an outpatient facility that does not have a hood, does not have a clean room, and you're mixing chemotherapy, including mitomycin, we highly recommend that you do not do this anymore because it's unlikely for you to become fully compliant by December 1st of 2019. Now, if you're going to take the risk assessment pathway, as I mentioned, that means you're only going to be using the final dosage forms of the drugs. You're going to do that by, like I said, completing that risk assessment and maybe performing some audits to ensure that you stay compliant. You're going to be doing a lot of staff education and keeping competencies on file for all of those staff. And you're going to be making some environmental changes, maybe reconsidering the workflow, maybe hanging signage and having spill kits available for your staff. But it is a much more cost-effective version, and you are only complying with the sections of 800 that are pertinent to your facility and to the drugs that you are stocking. Now, let's take a walk down that pathway and see what it looks like. Part of the risk assessment pathways is going to include standard operating procedures, or SOPs, and your policies and procedures for the facility. Now, standard operating procedures are different than policies. And a standard operating procedure, or an SOP, is a lot more detailed. It has information on step-by-step instructions. This is where we can draw for a lot of our education and developing those competencies. And really, if you picked up an SOP, you could likely go through a task step by step because of the amount of detail in there. Whereas a policy and procedure tends to be a little bit more administrative. They have their own purpose at your facility, but for the intents and purposes of USP 800, we really want to be talking about our SOPs. Now, some of our clients have asked us at JDJ Consulting if we can provide them with a single policy that will make them USP 800 compliant. And I'm sorry to say that no, we cannot. There is not a single policy, one single standalone policy rather, that is just going to make you USP 800 compliant. But what we will have is a policy that states we do have hazardous drugs, we do have a hazardous drug compliance program, here's where you can find more information, and here's what we're going to do to be compliant. Now that policy should be part of your policy manual and be approved by your board, but that is really just a placeholder in the policy manual to point you in the right direction for that compliance program. If you're a facility that does not have hazardous drugs, I still recommend that you keep a policy in your policy manual that states you do not have hazardous drugs, and then you are not required to be USP 800 compliant. But if you ever do stock hazardous drugs, you will certainly change that. Here is a list of the minimum standard operating procedures you should have if you are seeking USP 800 compliance. We're going to walk through these one by one, give a little bit more information. As you start to consider how you're going to become compliant, I think that it's important for you to walk through your facility, either mentally or actually physically do the walkthrough, and consider the life of the drug as it enters all the way to the time that it leaves your facility. So when you receive a package, what does that look like? How is that package of drugs transported? How is it unpacked or stored or brought to the OR or the unit? How is it administered? What does cleanup look like? What would you do if there was a spill? And how are those drugs disposed of? Is there any employee risk along the way? And all of this goes into that hazard communication program and occupational safety plan that we need to have under USP 800. All of this information is going to be very important for you to visualize as you begin that risk assessment. And until you've thought about how all of your staff at the facility might be coming in contact with the drug during every single step here, I don't think you'll be able to complete that risk assessment effectively. So take a few minutes, consider how the drug moves through your center, and then you should start to work on that risk assessment. So as you get started, think of this like your ingredient list. If you are going to make a recipe in your kitchen, there's always that ingredient list, and it tells you what you need to be prepared to start your recipe. So if you're going to start your pathway to compliance, this is your bare minimum that you really need to have in front of you. You really need to be familiar with General Chapter USP 800. And I've said it before, I'll say it again, I'll probably say it a few more times during this presentation. Please go online, download that document. It is free. You can get it from the United States Pharmacopoeia website. And I recommend that you make highlights and make notes and see what areas of that pertain to you. You'll need your formulary, and you'll need to make sure you identify the hazardous drugs. And you're going to notice as we move through the remainder of the presentation that anytime you see that little standard operating procedure icon, that means that's one of the areas that you will need an SOP. So take note, those are your main SOP areas. It's certainly not all inclusive, but as I mentioned, it's a bare minimum. Make sure you identify that approval process for your hazardous drugs, and this could be the same as how you have an approval process for any other medication in your facility. Is there a formal request for adding or deleting drugs from your formulary? Does your board approve your formulary on an annual basis? That will all need to be outlined in your SOP. You should also identify a person who is responsible for compliance. Now, I'm going to say that no matter how you handle USP 800, there should definitely be one person at your facility on site who understands the regulation and can at least be your point person on the day-to-day. Having said that, your official responsible party does not need to be a person on site, and they do not need to be a staff member. So this is especially important to remember if you're working with your consultant pharmacist for compliance, or if you're part of a management company or a healthcare network, because they might have a person on the corporate level who could be overseeing many different facilities' compliance programs, and they just visit you on occasion. So I think, like I said, it's still important to have that point person at your facility to be the oversight when your main compliance person is not available. Next up, you're going to start your actual risk assessment, right? So you're going to do a risk assessment for every single hazardous drug that has been identified on your formulary. And USP 800 does give you information about the minimum requirements for your risk assessment. And I'm going to show you an example of one in a moment. These need to be completed annually. And this is going to include a lot of very important information about your USP 800 exceptions. So this will tell you what you have to do or what your alternative plan is instead of full compliance. So let's take a look and I'll explain what I mean by that. Here is a sample risk assessment that we have developed. This is what we're using with our clients to help them become compliant with USP 800. So up top, you're going to identify your drug. You're going to identify the dosage form. Here you would maybe put if it's a vial or if it's liquid, if it's an oral tablet, but you should certainly put whether or not it is final dosage form. And the answer should always be yes if we're going for that risk assessment pathway. Next up, you're going to identify which group it is. And as I've mentioned, it's important that we know if it's group 1, group 2, or group 3, because that's going to help us determine exactly how we're able to seek exceptions from the chapter. I'd like to give a few examples under the organizational policy, just to give you an example of how we might be following USP 800, something that might not be applicable, and then an entity exemption. So if we go down to the third area, transport from receiving to storage, we could follow USP 800 and say that we're going to minimize the risk of breakage or leakage, because of course that would be our goal during transport. We would never want it to break or leak. That would be an exposure risk. So yes, we will follow USP 800 there, and our strategy could be that the hazardous drug would remain in its original container or as much of the original container as possible during transport to minimize the risk, because certainly if that could survive postal service or being shipped and jostled around, I'm sure that that package can survive the trip from your receiving area to your storage area where it would be unpacked. And of course, we want to make sure you're compliant with infection control risk, you're compliant with how you're supposed to be unpacking your materials at your facility. So make sure to reference your policy and your internal procedures for that. Next up is storage, next line down. And for that, we would say entity exemption, because it says that you would separate your non-hazardous drugs in a room that's negative pressure, externally vented, and has at least 12 ACPH, which is air changes per hour. I could tell you certainly how to calculate ACPH, but it's not necessary, because we're going to say entity exemption. And if we were doing an antineoplastic drug, say mitomycin, we could say that this antineoplastic drug would only be counted and then administered to the patient. And I would also say, see our standard operating procedure for detail. I would actually put that on there and point them to the SOP, so that if there's ever a question about how you're going to achieve that, you'll have more detail in that SOP. This specifically, that information could be found in USP 800 Section 5. You could certainly reference that there as well. I would just, have it as complete as possible, but while still making it concise. And then finally, the last example I'm going to give is transport from storage to compounding area. Well, if this is a facility that's only using final dosage forms and we're performing a risk assessment, then that's going to be not applicable, because there is no compounding area. There's not going to be any compounding performed of this drug. So now we've gone through an example of how we would follow USP 800 for some areas, how some of them would not be applicable, and how some would be an entity exemption. And of course, you could move down this entire risk assessment for each hazardous drug. You should also make sure to fill out the second page all the way through. Your risk of exposure section is very important, because you're going to describe any perceived risks and how you're going to prevent the risks. And then in documentation, that's where I would say, see SOP for administration, see SOP for transfer or storage. That's, again, going to point you towards your SOP for additional details. Now that we've gone through our risk assessment and we know what our risks are, we know what we have to do and what we don't have to do, we're going to develop an audit. So we have developed at JDJ a 10-page audit that details the requirements of all 18 chapters. And this has been extremely helpful, because it points us in the right direction. It tells us what our to-do list is. And quite honestly, it keeps everyone on task and makes sure we stay honest. So if we go back and repeat that compliance audit in a couple of months, we can say, oh, well, we were supposed to have spill kits in all of these areas. Where did they go? And it's because someone maybe, they weren't familiar with USP 800, they picked them up and moved them. And you want to go back and make sure little things like that don't happen, because things get moved easily. It's another great example of how you can stay compliant with new staff, right? So new staff are hired, people come, people go, and they need to be trained. They need to be familiar with USP 800. So you can double check yourself on this compliance audit to make sure they went through that in orientation and that you do have a competency on file for them. And we'll talk about that a little bit more during the section for education and compliance. Then we would move to facilities and engineering controls. So I did mention before, CPEC, CSEC, and alternative strategies. Now, a CPEC stands for Containment Primary Engineering Control, and that's really your hood, like a laminar flow hood. And then there's a CSEC, which is Containment Secondary Engineering Control, which is your clean room that the hood is located in. Now, if you are going your risk assessment pathway and you're not compounding and you don't have a hood and you don't have a clean room, all of the areas of USP 800 that discuss CPECs and CSECs are not applicable to you because you don't have them. You're doing that risk assessment pathway. But what is magical are your alternative strategies. That is an important magic word, because your alternative containment strategies, those are going to be everything you do at your facility to minimize your exposure risk. So anything you do that takes the place of a clean room, that you say, oh, we don't need a clean room because we do this, those are alternative containment strategies. And for engineering controls that you really need to consider and include in your standard operating procedures are, eye wash stations. And we don't mean, they don't have to be big industrial eye wash stations. They could be very simple. They sell them through many vendors, online healthcare vendors. You can have them very easily installed. Their sink needs to be close by to your handling areas, and your storage. You need to give special consideration to your storage, including refrigerators. So there's been some miscommunication about what's required for storage. And if you have those final dosage form hazardous drugs that you're not manipulating raw material, you're not compounding, you're not mixing, well, as long as you have your alternative containment strategies documented, your hazardous drugs can be stored in the same area as your non-hazardous drugs. Now, I highly recommend you consider signage and consider some exposure minimization strategies to make sure there's no mistake made, there's no leak possibility there. But you can have a discussion about how you're going to do that. You do not need a separate room. You do not need a completely separate storage area or separate refrigerator, depending on what you're stocking. So that's why this risk assessment is so important. And it's so important that you're working with someone that understands USP 800 well, because you're going to figure out ways that you might not necessarily need that second refrigerator to store your hazardous drugs. So make sure you pay special attention in your standard operating procedure to those details. And finally, I just want to reiterate that air exchange per hour we discussed before. If you are receiving final dosage forms, you do not need to comply with that area of 800. So please don't get hung up on it, and make sure you do address it in your standard operating procedure. Our next section is environmental quality and control. So this is a very interesting part of USP 800, especially for those who are going on the risk assessment pathway. You really need to pay special attention here when they talk about your final dosage form and your exceptions for your antineoplastics that are only counted or repackaged, because there's a lot of information here about wipe sampling for your surfaces and doing particulate counts, and they just don't apply if you're using antineoplastics that are only counted or repackaged, or group 2 or group 3 in final dosage form. This is another great example of that designated person, how they really need to be on top of it. And another very interesting thing about this chapter is how they say you need to document measurable contamination. But the chapter also says that we don't necessarily have acceptable levels of contamination. We don't have data yet on what we consider to be an acceptable amount of hazardous drug or residue left in an area. So you will have to determine what is acceptable at your facility in your standard operating procedure, and you will have to determine thresholds for when you might generate a variance report, or when you might need to document or report up, spills or mishandling of the drug. So again, include that in your standard operating procedure and make sure that your designated person is familiar enough with the chapter to understand how to develop that SOP. So our personal protective equipment, your PPE. Of course, we already have PPE on site. I know that you guys are using them every day as you care for patients, but this type of PPE is going to be a little different. We're not going to use normal surgical gloves. You're going to need chemo gloves. So depending on how you're handling and what form you're handling, whether it is an IM injection or a liquid or a tablet or pill, you might need 1 pair of chemo gloves or 2 pairs of chemo gloves. Now also consider, if you're handling hazardous drugs in the operating room, you would have to get sterile chemo gloves, right? So consider what type of PPE you need. We would also want to see impervious gowns, N95 respirators, and it would be acceptable to have N95 surgical masks, and then face protection as needed. That would be, any kind of hair covering, face splash shield, goggles, beard covers. We need to consider the healthcare worker from top to bottom. Now, we are working on compliance with our clients, and we actually have developed a list of recommended PPE. So if you were interested in talking about compliance with JDJ Consulting, this is one of the things we would provide to you, a list of pre-approved personal protective equipment that is USP 800 compliant. Your hazard communication program, think of it, the word communication, is how you're going to alert everyone in the facility of the hazards around them and the exposure risk. So some of the ways we might do this are container labeling, your safety data sheets and making sure they are available on site, making sure your staff are familiar with them and have been trained according to the SDS. Again, making sure your personnel have had the correct training and are aware of their risks. And then there's also a risk acknowledgement that they're going to have to sign, and that has to do specifically with any potential reproductive risk. Again, there are samples available online. We have a sample acknowledgement that we have developed, so if you're interested in learning more about that, please reach out. Personnel training, we've said it a couple times, we'll keep talking about it. It is incredibly important for USP 800 to have this component. Your personnel are going to have to be trained according to the SOPs. In fact, you're going to have an SOP about how the personnel are trained according to the SOPs. So even though it sounds circular, it's all just the good intention of making sure people know how to handle those hazardous drugs and they're able to do so appropriately in a safe way. So make sure that the initial training is provided and documented for all staff. Any new incoming staff has to have this included in their orientation. We need to have competencies documented, and we need to retrain on an annual basis. As I mentioned before, it's important to visualize every area of your facility that the hazardous drug might pass through. And it's really easy for us to think about, how we prepare the drug and how we administer the drug, but don't forget about your receiving area. And again, we'll need an SOP for that, and we'll need an SOP for how we might handle damaged or broken materials. So if a hazardous drug package arrives at your facility and it looks wet on the outside in a way that indicates whatever's inside could have been broken, how are we going to handle that? And have you trained your staff that received the drug how they should handle it and how they should use a spill kit? So we're going to need a spill kit in that area, and we're going to make sure that everyone's trained and knows what to do if that occurred. So just in case you haven't heard enough about your SOPs, here's an opportunity for one more. We are going to have an SOP that covers your labeling, packaging, transportation within your facility, and the disposal of those hazardous drugs, either the remnants, the wastage, expired hazardous drugs, or even the materials that have come into contact with it. And part of that is going to be giving consideration to who handles and transports the hazardous drugs. I know I've talked a lot about personnel training, but we need to make sure we even train people who transport the drugs on the right way to transport them according to your SOP. We should also talk about waste. And this is a really good place to take a small detour. I promised before that we would talk about hazardous waste versus hazardous drugs. So let's just have a small refresher on that topic. So I hope that these all look familiar to you. These are RCRA black bins. We hear a lot about the black bin, but the black bin is the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, RCRA. That's from the EPA, and this has to do with making sure hazardous waste is disposed of in the right way. Now, these black bins are treated very specifically for a certain kind of pharmaceutical waste. The types of drugs that might go into this bin would include nitroglycerin or very concentrated epinephrine. You can go online and search for EPA P and U list drugs, and there's actually a neat little search engine that you can type a drug name into, and it will tell you if it's P or U list, and if that's the case, it would have to go into this bin for disposal. Now, hazardous drugs are something different than hazardous waste, because there are some hazardous waste that comes from other things that aren't hazardous drugs. I just mentioned two drugs. I said nitroglycerin and concentrated epinephrine. Well, neither one of those are hazardous drugs. They're just hazardous waste. And it's because hazardous drugs pose an exposure risk to people. So think, drugs, people take medications, people. Hazardous waste is potentially harmful to the environment, and that's governed by the EPA. So waste, garbage, landfill, earth, right? So to be safe, we are actually going to put all of our hazardous drug waste into one of these black bins, because if they were dangerous enough to have all of these mitigation strategies while we're storing it and handling it and cleaning it up, well, we certainly wouldn't want to just put it in a regular trash can, because then anyone along the way at that point could be exposed to it. Your environmental people could be exposed to it, anyone who is servicing your garbage, people that are working on waste management, they could all be exposed to that hazardous drug. So we want to make sure that it's disposed of responsibly. So please put that waste into this black bin. And again, just want to reiterate, having a black bin is great. It is a step in the right direction, but it does not mean that you're already 100% compliant. It's just one small piece of compliance for 800. Another important component of the risk assessment pathway is dispensing only those final dosage forms. So it's very important, as we've said, that we do not compound or mix on site if we're doing the risk assessment. We only want to obtain drugs that are ready to administer. So we also need to make sure that we have dedicated equipment for those hazardous drugs. And here's an example of that. If you have a pill or tablet that you're going to be unit dosing out for administration, we don't want to put that on the same counter or in the same preparation area that we're using for other non-hazardous drugs. So here we might consider a medication preparation tray that is labeled and designated just for our hazardous drugs, and that would be cleaned and disinfected appropriately. So we would only use it for those final dosage forms, those pills or tablets of HDs. The administration section of USP 800 is another area that's caused a little bit of confusion. And I think that's because we need to pay special attention to whether the hazardous drug is a group 1, group 2, or group 3. One example would be group 1 antineoplastic drugs, and those must be administered with a closed system transfer device, or a CSTD. Now, the group 2 and group 3 are not required to be administered with a CSTD, but USP 800 does say to do so whenever possible. It also says to use needleless systems whenever possible, but it's not necessarily required. And this is important when we're talking about maybe our group 3 drugs or our group 2 drugs, that especially if it's on an emergency cart, you may need to grab them and administer them quickly. We also have to have the appropriate PPE worn and appropriate splash precautions in place. But it's important to note that there should be no spiking or priming of the drug before administration. When writing your SOP and developing your training, make sure that you pay special attention to which hazardous drugs each deactivating, decontamination, or cleaning agent actually acts on. Unfortunately, there is no blanket product that can be used on all hazardous drugs. So you're going to have to develop your cleaning process specific to each drug. And you can find information for that in your safety data sheet, but be sure to include that information in your SOP. You should also have designated cleaning supplies, or if possible, only use disposable cleaning supplies. Let's take a quick moment to review everything we've discussed. Now, this is a very simplified list of how you might achieve compliance, but overall, start with a checklist. Make that list of everything you need to do, have a clear vision for how you're going to accomplish it, and as you go through, start checking off those boxes. Keep yourself organized, and if you need to, delegate or ask for help. Go ahead and complete your risk assessments and make sure you have one for each hazardous drug on your formulary. Write your SOPs and be sure to reference each chapter of USP 800 as they apply. Develop your list of your personal protective equipment, or PPE, and make sure you know what PPE has to be worn for each handling scenario. Develop and deliver your education and training for your staff, and make sure to have documentation and competencies on file. And finally, document everything you do with 800. I recommend that you keep a binder or a file and keep everything together in one place. It will really help you stay organized, and it will help you reference it if you need to in the future. So I hope after watching this presentation, you feel a little more comfortable with how you're going to develop your pathway to compliance using the risk assessment and exceptions for USP 800. I do want to take this opportunity to let you know that JDJ Consulting has a full compliance package available for purchase. If you're interested, that package would include us performing the risk assessments for you, doing a compliance audit, performing all of the education and training necessary for your staff. We would provide you with a suite of standard operating procedures, and we would also manage your compliance from top to bottom and repeat audit as necessary. So if you're interested in that, please let me know, and we can discuss further and give you more information. Thank you again for watching our presentation, and if you have any questions or would like to contact us, please reach out. Have a wonderful day.